Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Jaycie Loewen, a clinical neuroscientist here at Cognitive FX. Today we're going to take a different spin on functional MRI and the neuron. We're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty details of what does functional MRI actually look at, starting all the way from some of the cells in the brain to what eventually you're going to see as an output from a functional MRI machine. So to start off, let's talk about some anatomy. We're very focused on neurons here, those cells in your brain that through signals can communicate and allow us to think, to move, to talk, to do everything that we do. Now in prior videos, we very much focused on the soma, the dendrites, and the axon. So essentially the body of the neuron and how it receives signals, as well as how that signal then propagate down to this area right here, or the synapse. The synapse is highly important. It's where neurotransmitters are released from the presynaptic neuron and then go on to target and then bind to receptors on the postsynaptic site. Now there are multiple different kinds of neurotransmitters. We're not going to get into that. Think of neurotransmitters like the signal that's allowing that message to go from one cell to the next to the next. Now, the brain is not just made of neurons. It is actually made up of neurons and a whole lot of other stuff. One of that other stuff is actually glial cells. A glial cell specifically called an astrocyte. We call these cells astrocytes because they look like star cells. They actually have these little appendages that go off, and those are very important because those astrocytes have a large role at the synapse. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Finally, we need to remember our blood vessels, or the way that energy, both oxygen, glucose, and other metabolites, can get to the neurons and the cells of the brain to not only maintain the brain's health, but also to allow the brain to do its job. So let's talk about the neurovascular unit. It'll sound similar in case you've watched videos talking about neurovascular coupling. The neurovascular unit is a unit by which the neurons, astrocytes, and blood vessels come together to allow the brain to participate in sustained active firing. As I'm standing here, my brain is sending enriched levels of blood flow through blood vessels to neurons through this mechanism. So let's do a quick diagram. So if you think of this as the blood vessel, so there's red blood cells and other things inside of that red blood cell. The astrocytes actually have end feet that surround these blood vessels. And then synapses are also part of this complex. Now, what's amazing about this neurovascular unit is that you, in fact, have a cell that's sending a signal from one place to another, which is right next to an enriched energy source. And you have a mediator cell, this astrocyte, who can then all together cause either vasodilation, where this blood vessel may get bigger, or vasoconstriction, where that blood vessel will get smaller in order to regulate blood flow per what is needed in that select area of the brain. So that's what we're talking about when we consider the neurovascular unit. Now, how does this relate to MRI? Well, something we have to remember is that any time that there is blood flow going to part of the brain, when there is activity in that area, oxygen, or O2, is going to get consumed. It's going to get eaten up. Now, what's fascinating is that when we're considering these red blood cells that are taking this oxygen to parts of the brain, there's two things that are happening. There's enriched oxygen going to that part, and then with consumption of that oxygen, suddenly you're having certain red blood cells that are now having less of that oxygen in them. So we call this oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Now, with the use of a giant magnet, which can then see the magnetic properties of each of these types of blood flow, you can actually see curves and analyze them, looking at how much oxygenated blood flow is going to a specific part of the brain and the ratio of oxygenated to deoxygenated blood once it's consumed. Now, this is the core of functional MRI. Functional MRI does not look at brain activity like, for example, an EEG. It is looking at this neurovascular unit and neurovascular coupling, the coupling between a brain area that is being activated to do a task and oxygenated blood flow going to that area, which is then consumed. Now, when we're looking at the output from the functional MRI, what you're probably expecting is this fancy images with oranges and blues that's beautifully mapped up onto a structural scan of someone's brain. That's not what comes out of a functional MRI. In fact, what comes out of a functional MRI are ratios and just numbers. In fact, if you open up an image from a functional MRI, you're going to see this gray blobby shape that you're going, I don't know what this means. In fact, to process functional MRI data, you need programs and neuroscientists on your team in order to figure out what all of this means and how to then demonstrate it. In addition, if you're going to determine whether blood flow to a certain area of the brain is healthy or is not healthy, like in post-concussion syndrome, you're also going to need a normative population. In essence, thousands of scans from healthy individuals who have done that same functional MRI battery of tests so that you can then compare somebody with a certain disorder, like post-concussion syndrome, to that population. So in fact, what gets spit out from a functional MRI is just numbers. Now that is very essential because if you have data from a specific area of the brain, let's take the frontal cortex here, and it is showing increased levels of neurovascular coupling. So again, higher speeds of oxygenated blood flow going to that area, and then high speeds of that oxygen being consumed. And then you can compare that to subcortical areas, which may have less neurovascular coupling dynamics, so less blood flow being provided to that area and less blood flow being consumed. You can then come up with therapy or treatment that is targeted to that specific brain, to that specific individual. So to summarize, functional MRI takes into account cellular mechanisms. It takes into account the real life aspects of what's going on into the brain in order for that brain to function. Also, under the right circumstances, it can be used to develop a normative database and to detect biomarkers of injury in specific disorders. Thank you for your time. If you've got any questions, please leave a comment below and please see our other videos.